Welcome to the CNBC Africa Debate, coming to you from the annual meeting of New Champions 2013, Dalian, the People's Republic of China. We're talking investment to innovation and how we can unlock foreign investment potential when it comes to both entrepreneurship and innovation on the African continent. To my immediate right, we are joined by Zhong Jianhua, Special Representative of the Chinese government on African affairs, Claire Akamanzi, who is CEO of the Rwanda Development Board, Jahendra Naidu, Chairman of the J&J Group, Deborah Brautigan, who is Director of International Development at Johns Hopkins University, USA, and Montlatlata, who is Chairman of the Industrial Development Corporation, South Africa. Thank you all for joining me for this session. Africa's rise has been well documented, but for us to sustain that growth at above the global average, we need to transform quickly, Claire, from a resources-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. Do you think that 10 years out, this is a reality?
Well, I think looking at Rwanda's story in particular, which is what I'm very familiar with, I think it's possible. 10 years ago, when Rwanda was putting in place its Vision 2020, the economy was three-quarters agriculture, more than 90% employment in agriculture, moreover subsistence agriculture. Today, as we speak, Rwanda is about 70% employment in agriculture, 47% in the services sector, of which about 17% of our GDP is actually coming from the ICT sector. So if that can happen in a country like Rwanda, with the history that we had in 1994, starting from a very low base, I think that countries that are even starting, or which started at a much higher level, can actually make this happen. So I think it's very possible. And our own target as a country is to reach the year 2020 as a middle-income status country with a knowledge-based economy. And I think that's really a path that we're already on. So I think it's possible.
Deborah, China has certainly been leveraging resources on the African continent, and that has been well documented, giving Africa the opportunity to invest in infrastructure ultimately. How quickly can Chinese capital help us achieve our goal into the knowledge-based economy?
Well, the knowledge-based economy has to be based on some very basic infrastructure. And one of the shortages in Africa is infrastructure. The World Bank estimates that African countries should be spending about $93 billion a year to build and maintain infrastructure. And they're only spending about half of that. And so here's where China and natural resources can fit together. The Chinese have developed some interesting instruments so that African countries that have natural resource exports can use those exports to secure lines of credit that can be used to build infrastructure. Now, of course, these lines of credit will be used to build infrastructure, and the Chinese companies are the ones that will do the building. But it's actually a model that has a lot of potential. So you have countries that are just emerging from war. You have countries that have not been investing in their infrastructure. They can secure these lines of credit with an export, and they can use that to build the infrastructure that they need, which is going to be the foundation for any kind of investment in the future, whether it's innovation, technology, industrialization. You've got to have power. You've got to have roads. You've got to have new ports. How do countries pay for that? They can pay for it with future resources.
Zhong, how soon before we can move from that investment in infrastructure to Chinese investment in manufacturing and services? And I know you're quite passionate about knowledge transfer. Is that already starting to happen on the African continent?
It is start happening now. And we are very happy to see that because with all this development and all this pretty fast growth of GDP in the African countries, we've already seen, probably Chinese always compare with Africa itself. That is, we've already seen these African countries step into those years just like the 80s in China. They have already started to develop their own economy. And some African scholars proudly declare, we are the last frontier. Please come to us. And I think Chinese private and state-owned companies see this as opportunity. Some of the investments already been put into African countries, like we see the cement companies in China make their investment in Ethiopia, in South Africa, and making pretty big profit. And the shoe industry in Ethiopia is also pretty promising. And I think all this is happening, but not big enough, not quick enough. That's what we see. Even for Chinese entrepreneurs, it's a big challenge to go outside China to Africa. Sometimes it's an even bigger challenge for them. So what Chinese government is doing, just like our premier just said the day before yesterday, we try to push them. We try to promote the Chinese companies to look outside, find all these opportunities outside, particularly in Africa, because the potential of demand and the potential of the market in Africa is huge. So we put a lot of things, put a lot of efforts on that. We hope that we can be successful. And it's a win-win situation for both of us.
Mutla, on that entrepreneurship note, the International Monetary Fund says that 84% of all entrepreneurs across the African continent are either not served or underserved. The Industrial Development Corporation, how are you working with foreign capital to alleviate that situation?
You know, one of the greatest opportunities about the kind of model that China is beginning to show in our continent is the opportunity to slightly move that investment, which results in good infrastructure, a little further into looking at the possibility to manufacture some of the raw material before you export them to China, so that you actually allow the opportunity for the citizens of Africa to develop a skill and to produce goods that can be purchased in the marketplace. And the Industrial Development Corporation has made that quite a mission to look at opportunities to partner across the continent with various companies, to incentivize them to think beyond just the, you know, the large returns that they make because of the current conditions, because of a great need. The returns that you're able to make on an investment in Africa are substantially large. But that large return masks the opportunity to share the proceeds in a clever way to sustain your business into a longer term. The Industrial Corporation is a state-owned enterprise that finances industrial development across the continent, from Cape to Cairo. So in more ways than one, between ourselves, the African Development Bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, you've got a vast number of development funding companies with the capital necessary to partner with companies to just think more creatively. A great example is Nokia. The utilization of Nokia telephones in Africa is quite vast and is still growing. But a smart CEO and executive team decides, well, if this is going to be a great place that likes our product, why not establish a technology lab in Kenya so that we start doing some creative things to see the extent to which we can develop products that suit Africa. And I think that's the opportunity we're trying to say to every company, to every business owner, to every entrepreneur. Take a chance at it. It will grow, there will be a market, and there will be partners to take on the risk with you.
Johendra, you're an entrepreneur operating across Africa. Are you unlocking foreign capital? Is it available to you? Is it easy to find?
I think foreign capital is a similar species to local capital, which is based on what the risks are and what the returns are. And innovation is very cool, but in the end, every project's got to make money. And so I don't counterpose innovation to investment, or neither resources to IT. We invest in both, because it is, does require innovation to be in a cement company. There's a lot of science in that, or in a resources company. So I think what one hopes to do is to develop African brands that can become well established in Africa and also globally. That becomes a challenge.
Point that you made, that foreign capital is like local capital, and obviously it's dependent on risk. One of the major gripes of entrepreneurs across the continent is the lack of access to finance. And perhaps that's just the point that I'm trying to get to. It's not easy to come by, or is it?
Well, they're not. Africa is relatively short of assets, so the kind of things you've got to invest in is developing new assets, new solar farms, new power plants, startup ventures, and I think that's on a higher risk end of the spectrum. But there's plenty of investments that are also well established that can become the building block, because our demand is growing quite a lot, especially out of South Africa.
And Claire, Jahendra hits the nail on the head there with one of the other major issues that entrepreneurs are dealing with across the African continent, and that is interrupted power supply. We've got to be innovative when it comes to energy solutions, and much debate has taken place at this specific meeting around those innovative energy solutions. Are you seeing foreign capital in Rwanda coming to the fore when it comes to energy?
Well, maybe if I could also just touch on a point that you raised earlier. How do you tap foreign capital? Before I come to the energy question, how do you tap into foreign capital for solutions within the country to tap into entrepreneurship and innovation? And I think that both foreign investments and also the recipients have to be adaptive in the way they develop partnerships to make that happen. And I'll give an example of Visa International in Rwanda. Visa came into Africa, and they found that in Africa, mobile phone penetration was very high. And so if they were going to be able to be successful in Africa, they had to adapt how they did business, and they had to innovate something new called M-Visa, which is really mobile payment solutions based on the mobile phone. And that's the only way they could actually reach out big numbers. Otherwise, traditional Visa businesses would mean that they'd be limited to very few people in the market. So they innovated something really new called M-Visa. And they're piloting it in Rwanda and India very successfully. And I think that's something that investors have to be very they have to be able to adapt to. What do you find on the market, and how do you bring solutions that actually fit in the market, not the traditional ways that you think about? And I think that's the only way you can actually come up with new solutions.
So disruptive technologies, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. Now, back to the question on energy. Yes, energy is changing. It's probably the biggest problem that every country is facing, including Rwanda. But I think that investments are coming into, in different sources. I'm seeing whether it's Kenya or Ethiopia, Tanzania, Rwanda. I'm seeing new investments in methane gas to power. I'm seeing peat to power. I see hydropower. And I think there's a lot more to expect. Obviously, power is very long term. You have a project that takes 3 to 5 years before you see the solutions. But I think things are changing on the continent.
Deborah, can I get you to weigh in here? I see you are nodding away at the fact that the energy is in short supply across the continent.
It's a huge problem. When you have an average of 30 hours of power per week in Nigeria, that means that every producer there has got to invest in expensive backup power. So that's just not sustainable for any kind of foundation for economic transformation. And so we can see there is a lot of interest in alternative sources of power and traditional sources. So we're looking at renewables like hydropower and wind power, and also in solar power. But coal-fired and gas-fired power plants, countries like South Africa are investing in these areas. Some are controversial in terms of their environmental impact. These are questions and challenges that still have to be overcome. But I do think that things are changing. And as we can see from these growth rates, as we can see from the investments that have been made in infrastructure, this foundation is starting to become firmer. And Africa right now has an opportunity because there's something happening here in China, which is that labor is getting more expensive, companies are moving up the value chain, and they're going offshore. And so it's an opening right now. If you can attract these companies to come in and partner with your local entrepreneurs to make use of your local raw materials and add value to them, it's a window of opportunity. It's not going to stay open forever. So those countries that can get their act together now, to invite in these entrepreneurs that are looking. It's called by the Japanese the flying geese model, where you have a lead goose who's starting in a sector, and then they move off, and then others take the lead. And so Africans are now in the opportunity where they can move beyond just providing the raw materials at the base of the value chain and move up the value and get into the value added. So countries are doing that, and I've been working in Ethiopia, and Ambassador Zhang mentioned that Huajian, a major Chinese shoe company, is now at the point, I think they have about 2,000 jobs that they've created in Ethiopia. But it's not just Huajian. Other companies have been coming in, and there's an interesting development where European companies are moving from China into Ethiopia. So I've seen Italian and German and British companies coming and moving their Chinese operations into Ethiopia to take advantage of the leather and skin sector there and adding value. So that's a very exciting development. And they're partnering with Ethiopian entrepreneurs who have leather tanneries and moving up the value chain in terms of getting higher quality raw materials. So it's very exciting.
Monica, it's also been well documented that to allow for innovation and entrepreneurship, we need almost a change management system to take place within African governments. Is it happening? And it's not just being spoken about.
I actually think it's a global phenomenon. We live at a time when citizens are saying that they also have a stake in every investment that we make. Anywhere in the world where you try and put infrastructure today, the communities where you put it are saying, let it not pass me. I want to partake in it as well. So the whole world is, and all of our companies and government have got to think about, with people having a voice and being able to access each other across the world because of the mobile telephony, how do I make sure that my models are beginning to ensure that they all see themselves benefiting from everything that I do? That calls for innovation and a different thinking about almost everything we do. There is no simple formula. Africans themselves, something that we're not talking about here. The biggest change in the continent is our own aspirations and the ability to understand that the extent to which, as African entrepreneurs and African managers and African business leaders, that we create economies of scale for the investments that we make, the better off we are. Today, Africans are speaking more to each other, investing across African countries, creating a base of entrepreneurs for any global company to go and partner with. You will find them investing everywhere in the continent, to the extent that I will give you an example around rail, around energy, and infrastructure that is happening across the continent, at least in South Africa or Southern Africa. You will find that every player that is in the world is today testing how they can find new models to operate within the continent. I think I needed to say that oftentimes we find it, we take time to recognize the availability of real entrepreneurs, existing men and women in the continent, that will make it easier for these companies to find partners, as the examples you have had in Ethiopia, in Rwanda. There are challenges, yes, but I think it's not unique to Africa. The uniquenesses of Africa, maybe the extent to which our levels of development, especially on the HDI side, is still much lower, but we're the same.
Another theme that has been discussed repeatedly at this forum is that we're going to look at the world in a couple of years, not as developed and developing countries, but as innovators and non-innovators. How far down the track is China in achieving that innovator status? I know they've been aggressive on their research and development spend. I think it's now sitting at some 2% of GDP, which is above the global average.
I know talking about the innovation is always fashionable, and people always put everything in the innovation. And, but I think for quite some time, the world is still being developing country and developed country. Even if we have this innovation be fashionable, be very good for country to develop, but still, I think the status probably not be able to easily change. But for China, we always go back to compare China with Africa. I think the biggest innovation in China happened in the last 40 years is the reform. It's the system innovation. Without the system innovation, first by Deng Xiaoping himself, nothing will happen after that. So what do we have achieved? First is out of this innovation of system innovation. And then we have this entrepreneurship and hard working from the Chinese people, and also the foreign investment all come into play this. So I think what we're talking about the development of African continent, first we still have to think the initiative of African people. This is the most important thing. Everything else can assist them or help them or work together with them. But without initiative of African people, nothing will happen. But we see very happily now it is happening. This kind of consensus is being reached among African people, African countries, that it's our opportunity. It's African people's opportunity. We're very happy to see that. And we combine our future together with development of African country. Just like Deborah said, a lot of jobs going to move out of China into this continent. And some people say, are you going to be challenged? I say, of course we are being challenged. We've been challenged from the very beginning. New challenges always coming, probably even new crisis. But after this challenge and after this crisis, China will move forward. We see the huge demand created by the development of this continent, the people, the 1 billion people, eager to improve their life. That's the opportunity for the world, also for China. So we see this is a new trend, this new direction. We're happy to participate.
You know, Bronwyn, talking about initiative of the African people, I want to bring this point of what I see as a raised level of accountability that's on the continent today than we've seen before, where African people can actually hold their leaders accountable. I think that's very important. When you look at, for example, Kenyan elections and Kenyan leaders debating before they're voted, you know, and bringing issues that are important to African people and them asking questions, I think that's really important. But another example is in Rwanda, where leaders sign performance contracts with the president of the country. And they say, this year, I'm going to make sure that I build 300 more classrooms in my district as a mayor, or I'm going to make sure that we plant 500 hectares of coffee this year, you know, to that detail. And then you have every year one opportunity a year where all the leaders come together and then the public asks them questions. You know, how far did you go with 500 hectares? You know, you only did 300. You know, what happened? That level of accountability.
Performance management of policymakers by the people sounds very good.
Yeah, I think that's very important because with that kind of accountability, you get people demanding more and creating more initiatives than were actually being done before.
Jahendra, let's get you in on this. If I was to make you president of entrepreneurship and innovation continent-wide, Africa-wide, what is the first thing you would do?
First thing, I would congratulate you on such a good choice. Then the second thing, I'd have to deal with this dilemma, which is in order for development to take place of infrastructure and all of these huge projects, you need to make sure that you are doing the right thing quickly, and that means low risk. So the huge flood of investments from countries that have got established technologies becomes preferred, which is what happens. And if local people in Rwanda or Kenya or South Africa are developing brand new technologies, you say, this is great, I'd like to support you, but let me first build this bridge, this road, this railway using stuff that everyone knows works. And I think that's the dilemma between investing innovation and investing in things that make an immediate difference. So what governments would have to do is to find ways to support the development of local capabilities, local technologies. Now take the example you used about Visa. Visa is great, but it's what the mobile operators who are developing whole new ways of transferring money, which is a big thing in Africa. They're not moving fast enough, although they would say they are, but they're not moving fast enough because you want somebody else to take the risk to say, who's ensuring this process? And it's always somebody who's done this business outside the country. So that's the kind of the challenge. Now, how do you fix that? You've got to consciously shape your procurement and your policies and your state-owned activities in such a way that you're promoting these dual objectives of investment
You
and
set out
innovation.
a number of objectives, not just one thing. I hope you would be prepared to sign a performance management agreement with all the entrepreneurs on the ground across the continent.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's a great innovation. And I mean, especially as technology advances, you can actually manage this more and more. But performance managing public officials as much as you performance manage leaders in any company, that's a great thing that should get further.
Deborah, we've spoken about emerging technologies, the mobile revolution, and how that is impacting across the continent. Claire referred to mobile money and payments that are being made across the system. Biotechnology, where do we stand in revolutionizing the agricultural environment on the continent?
We haven't made as much progress in biotechnology and agricultural revolution as we need to in Africa. And this is a really interesting area because, of course, we've had experience with trying out the green revolution. And what we found in the past was that the green revolution, in some places it worked. In the Gambia, for example, the areas where they have green revolution irrigation have done a lot better than the areas that relied on rain-fed. But there aren't that many countries where the green revolution took hold the way it did in Asia. So that whole agricultural revolution is still in its infancy in Africa. And we're not just talking about things like the debates over GMOs and whether or not genetically modified seeds should be used in Africa, and a lot of countries are concerned about that because they export into Europe. But we're talking about just basic improved seeds and using fertilizer. And African use of modern technology in agriculture is still very, very limited. So there's a huge area of potential there. But it's also controversial because right now, most countries in Africa, and of course South Africa is an exception, but they're dependent on peasant agriculture, very subsistence agriculture, not really into the cash economy, and very low yields. So this is a wrenching change that needs to happen, where commercialization has to enter into the agricultural sector. But how does it happen in a way where people's livelihoods are not put at risk, or people are not having their land grabbed, and big corporations coming in and taking over from the smallholders that exist? It has to be done in a way that's sensitive. So things like shareholding arrangements, where people have share the risk and share the profit in moving upward in the value chain in agriculture. There's a lot of potential for this, but we have a long way to go in that area. And we're still just trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and how to frame this in a way that can be developmental, but also modernizing.
Monica, this is obviously a debate that's happening at the Industrial Development Corporation as we speak.
I'm pleased that you're talking about, looking at the best way to do it and engaging with the right people, because it's true that's just where we are. Because the bulk of the continent relies on the small farmer. But if you had asked me the nice question you asked my friend here, Giandra,
Okay, get
I see you want that question. I tell you what I'll do. I'll make you vice president. Yes. I'll make you vice president.
If I do, then I'll continue this thing that a woman can't be president. So I would rather take the first one. President. I just think the whole scenario about the opportunity that mobile telephony has given to the continent to access that peasant farmer, who the strangest thing is that in the middle of Africa anyway, you'd find an old person with a cell phone, with a mobile phone, which means that they can connect to everybody. And that's why we have new technologies and tools. And if there is one investment that can be prioritized among many that we do in infrastructure, it's on the harmonization of broadband. Imagine the possibility that the cost of it is down because they are innovating with mobile telephony, whether or not you or I are actually there to give them extra money. They're connecting to markets, they're speaking to other people, they're being able to buy, they're able to bank. I think the greatest opportunity today to do something fast and massive, where people can begin to improve their lives while government is still dealing with some of their structural issues, is on this telephony issue. If we can make it more cheaper, more accessible everywhere, and simpler, the African continent can be able to begin to engage so that when we come with the big solutions, we are speaking to already informed individuals.
Jean, staying with the skills transfer, again, that being your hobby horse. Deborah on her blog recently referred to some 100 farmers or agriculture experts from China that were sent to Africa. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. How many of these experiments are working when it comes to knowledge transfer? I would assume that cultural differences are quite an issue.
Totally agree with you. Sometimes I just wondering, this agriculture, why they put these two things together? Agriculture actually connect with culture very much. We have some successful, but I think sometimes the cultural factors become very important. I had some example that Chinese rice expert went to Mauritania to help them to plant rice. And they do consume rice. It's good for the market. But they did pretty successful at first. And the water is good, land is good, very fertilizing. And the first year, very promising, they're going to have a very bumper harvest. Very good. But when it comes to the harvest season, it just happened to be Ramadan. Most of the local people are Muslim. Now, not supposed to work after sunrise until sun sets. But for the rice harvest, it's only just a few days. If we don't have this rice harvest, it's going to become rotten in the fields. the Chinese experts become crazy. How can they have these guys come to harvest after sunset? You can only work hours. In China, in those days, I work in the village in the 1960s, 1970s, that's very present, I know. You have to work 16 hours in the fields to get all because it's the result of 1 whole year's hard working. If you don't have it, the whole year's work has been ruined. So if you don't combine all this technology with the local culture, you will never succeed. And also we have problem of the freshwater fish farming. You know, freshwater fish is notorious for its small bones. I think probably most of the world will not have this kind of small fish with so many small bones, only the Chinese. But we try to introduce to Africa. I don't know. I don't know whether they can be successful or not. So all these things, some people just think that we have this so successful in China. It should be successful in Africa. Not always, not always.
What about other foreign capital? The US, for instance, Deborah, and skills transfer, knowledge transfer. Can we fast track that process?
Well, we're trying. President Obama was just in Africa, and he promised to get back to the infrastructure issue. He launched the Africa Power Initiative. It's partly our response to China and what the Chinese are doing to finance infrastructure, but I would say if he had asked me about it, and he didn't directly anyway, I would say that it's too little too late in terms of responding to China, because we're prepared to put in about $7 billion over 5 years, and out of this be $1 billion a year out of our Ex-Im Bank. And out of our aid budget, it's only about $250 million over 5 years. So that's very little. And when you look at what the Western donors are putting into infrastructure in Africa, it's about 10% of aid is going into infrastructure. So I think we could be doing a lot more. In the US, our aid is going into health. So we're doing HIV, AIDS, and malaria. That's the bulk of our aid going into Africa. In terms of investment, we are just at the start of moving out of the natural resource sector. So we're not doing much in manufacturing investment. When I was in Ethiopia, I saw, as I mentioned, Europeans, Chinese, Indians are all investing in the leather sector, and the Ethiopian government has put some good policies in place. So they've got a setup. There were no American companies there. So I think we have a long way to go before we start looking at Africa as a place for innovation, a place where you can invest, a place beyond, on the one hand, for rescue out of our aid program, and the other hand, for extracting natural resources out of our investors.
Coming up after the break, we continue with our discussion on how foreign investment can tap into, as well as unlock Africa's innovation and entrepreneurship potential. Plus, our audience gets the opportunity to engage with our panel of distinguished guests. Over 1,500 delegates from across the globe gathered in Dalian, China, for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting of the New Champions. With the theme of meeting the innovation imperative, this year's forum was dedicated to discussing the role of innovation in addressing global economic challenges. As part of this year's official proceedings, CNBC Africa sat down with a panel of expert guests as they discussed how foreign investment can tap into and unlock Africa's innovation and entrepreneurship potential. Claire, coming back to the earlier theme, and that's transforming from a resource-based economy in Africa to a knowledge-based economy, one way to fast-track that process is through education and looking at a new generation of universities where you teach, where you research, and where you show people how to commercialize products. Now, I know you've got a very innovative solution in Rwanda when it comes to a new generation university.
Well, I think that for many of the solutions, what we've seen in Rwanda is that developing unique public-private partnerships has been very crucial. And for education, we created conditions that would make it attractive for a university like Carnegie Mellon University to come to Rwanda. Now, initially, it's very expensive to take Rwandans to study at Carnegie Mellon in the US. But Carnegie Mellon has opened branches elsewhere in the world, none in Africa at the time, until we went to them and showed them the conditions that were attractive for them to come to Rwanda. So Carnegie Mellon opened its first branch, its first campus in Africa in Rwanda 2 years ago. But in creating that condition, we had to link them up to a center of excellence. And so we brought Carnegie Mellon, we brought development partners to build a center of excellence with a university and an innovation hub called K-Lab, and government coming together. And what we've seen is that now we can actually train in computer engineering, software engineering in Rwanda by Carnegie Mellon. And it had to take an innovative public-private partnership model that would make it attractive for them to come to Rwanda.
Focusing on these innovation hubs, they are sprouting up all over Africa. Claire refers to the K-Hub in Rwanda. We've got the I-Hub in Nairobi. We've got Innovate Lagos in Nigeria. We've got the Innovation Center in Pretoria, South Africa. Montla, what do you do at an innovation hub? What can you go to the innovation hub for?
For the further development of your product idea. I think South Africa has seen enormous innovations coming through for many, many years already. And these innovation hubs give the possibility for somebody who has been having this burning idea that could at least pass the test of looking like it could be commercialized, to come and work on it, being guided, and then to take it further. But I also think that the idea is to get our children at schools everywhere to start knowing that the little things they dream about, they can also learn to use them and to maybe change the way we do things. I think the whole culture of innovation over time worldwide, we will all realize that maybe the format of education that we've had so far, all of us, misses the ability to, from very early on, learn how to be solving issues of your life along the way. But the labs are very useful. They give us, I think our biggest weakness in South Africa has been the inability to then take those technologies and fund them and develop them in South Africa. So most of them, you'll see them coming up all over the world, but we are trying to improve in that.
Jahendra, as president of entrepreneurship and innovation, do you think that you perhaps were remiss in leaving out education and fostering that culture of entrepreneurship in your opening objectives?
Yeah, education and skills development, both absolutely key. But I want to follow on what my competitor for the position of president has been saying, because she runs a very big state-owned enterprise in South Africa. And when you listen to the discussion about the US investment, which is great and very welcome, it is linked to US goods and services. And what South Africa, which has the capital and should in a way have the mindset of being a foreign investor in Africa, we should be also doing the same thing, which is putting money behind South African goods and services going into Africa to compete together on a level footing with the US firms and other countries, because all this investment is linking to local economies from wherever the investment comes. And I think that's quite important. So the other thing I'd like to share is, looking at this fish farm, and those are great stories. And it makes the point that in order for foreign and local investments to work, you actually need a lot of interaction, good partnership. It's intelligence about the technology, it's intelligence about the regulatory environment, it's intelligence about the culture, so that you can plan these things, say, okay, this is how it works. There's always a solution to anything, but it requires fine-tuning of partnerships. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's got to be shareholders in the same company, but there's different modes of partnership. I think that's key for successful ventures.
Deborah, you want to follow on from that? We are opening to the audience for questions, so if you do have any burning questions for our panelists, please put up your hand, and we will deploy a roving mic. Deborah.
I wanted to remind everybody, when we're talking about capital shortages and Africans not having access to capital, that there is a lot of capital in Africa. We know that it's leaving. The capital flight coming out of Africa is enormous. So there is enough indigenous capital in Africa that could be available to invest in projects with good returns. And there are also indigenous models of innovation and investment that we've seen. And I've been doing research in eastern Nigeria where they have a venture capital model, where people that have earned capital out of trade or other activities invest in other people in that area, and they've invested in manufacturing. So this is an area they sometimes call the Japan of Africa. It's been called the Taiwan of Africa. Maybe they're now calling it the China of Africa. I don't know. No, but it's a very dynamic area where they are investing in their other neighbors in that area, and they're going into manufacturing. And they've done this in part, they're getting ideas, they're getting technology transfer from Asia. They started first from Hong Kong, and now they're doing joint ventures with Chinese partners. So I've talked to entrepreneurs there. I was there in 2009. I met Innocent Chukwuma, who's an industrialist, and he's doing plastic parts. So I said to him, I heard that the plastics industry has been wiped out in Nigeria. How can you compete? And he said, well, I buy all my equipment in China. He said, I pay my workers about the same as workers get paid in China. I have better quality. I've got a really good distribution network. I'm selling all over Nigeria and in the neighboring countries. And he said, I can't produce things fast enough. So he also had investment from people in that area in Nigeria. So he got technology transfer, he got the capital locally, and it was an innovative model. He's booming.
I am aware that you're going to ask a question. Montla, would you like to just follow on from that?
I'm very happy that you mentioned the whole thing about the notion that there is shortage of capital. Maybe the challenge is accessing the capital, but there is capital in the continent. Yes, it can be supported. And secondly, that there are models in the continent that are very informative and very innovative. I mean, in South Africa, the women of South Africa meet in committees year after year, and they have saved tons of money. The little bit of innovation our banks could do is to just bank their money. And none of them can ever use that money for anything more. In fact, the banks go back to them and charge them enormous fees for money that belongs to the cooperatives of women. And that money is what holds the communities where they live. Innovation says, how do we get them to move further on the entrepreneurial ladder using that kind of capital? This is a perfect example.
If I can open to the floor.
Hi, Samantha Loring. I just want to ask a question around education. I don't know who would be interested in answering it, but I think a lot of the discussion is around innovation, but you really need people, and of course people resources, and of course the education system across the African continent in general is certainly lacking. So what are the ideas around leapfrogging traditional education methods right now, which are inadequate, and looking at non-traditional education methods, innovative education that would be appropriate, accessible, affordable on the continent?
Claire, perhaps you'd like to give this a go, and Montla, I see you've signaled that you're ready for it.
Well, I think one of the ways, first of all, I agree, changing the way education is conducted today is very important, especially from memorizing kind of education to practical solutions. And one of the ways we're doing that is to look at vocational training, technical vocational training, where you actually train somebody to become an electrician, or you train somebody to become a construction worker, specific skills that are very practical, and that as an alternative to conventional education. And I think that's a way that many African countries can actually improve education and make it more practical for solutions that are required in the economy.
Montla?
I think it's also important to know that it's not either or. It's about augmenting the systems that exist of education, of starting in primary school, making an exam paper, and then passing, with other innovative ways to get people to have the skills to do things for themselves. And I think the South African government has just signed with the private sector a huge partnership around education and training, in which they are exploring various ways to improve vocationally the skills of people on the ground. But the notion that Africa has no trained people at time zero, so no company can come in, it's a myth. It's about the ability to have sustainable volumes of people that can join your workforce. But to come to Africa today, you will find people that have gone to the same schools as you in international companies. But what we're talking about is the ability to generate a sustainable volume of numbers of skilled people over time.
If I could just get roving mics to the front of the room here, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ellis Miandu. I'm the editor of Business Report in South Africa. My question is for Mr. Zhong. I'd just like to know, how do you see the China-Africa relationship evolving over the next 10 to 20 years? And I'm asking this question because in these sort of conversations and forums, we always speak of Africa as a country, but it's not a country. It's made up of a lot of countries with varying degrees of needs and varying, aspects of progress. So help us understand what is likely to inform China's engagement with Africa from a multidimensional perspective.
I think in the next 10 years or next 20 years, what you said, that I'm still quite happy to see both sides have the willing to continue with this friendship and the cooperation. But as time goes on, both sides realize we probably need to do more to strengthen this relationship. The Chinese people, African people, Chinese government, African government, and also the business side. More people come forward to see this become more and more necessary and more demand for both sides to work together. With this foundation, I'm quite optimistic about the future of the relationship. But talking about the differences of African countries, I totally agree with you. So dealing with each particular African country, you need to understand the history, the culture, the difference of the neighbor and other African country. They should be dealt with one by one, very respectively and very honored way to understand that. I think the relationship between China and Africa become more and more mature. And with all our experience and friendship in the past few decades, we are quite confident we will move forward.
Deborah, can you add your thoughts as well in terms of where we're going to see China-Africa 10 years out?
I think the relationship has been bumpy in recent years. It's not a new relationship. Obviously, the Chinese have been in Africa since the 1960s, and a lot of people didn't realize that. And this whole commercial investment engagement and the sharp rise in trade is a recent phenomenon, but it has very deep roots. But one of the reasons why it's been bumpy is that each year brings in new companies that have never been to Africa before. And so there's this whole acclimatization process that comes on about learning about cultures, learning about how things are done, labor regulations. And these are companies on a sharp learning curve. So they're coming from environments, they're going out often for the first time, they're coming to African countries. They don't speak the language very well, they don't read the labor regulations, they don't know about the environmental standards, and they're running into problems. So this is something that I think there's going to continue to be bumps on the road in this relationship, and we've seen quite a few of those quite visibly. But I do think as the larger companies now have been there for quite a while, and they're actually getting a pretty good business reputation. If you look at companies like Huawei, for example, they're all over Africa. They've set up training centers. They're adding a lot to countries. They're building the hardware of the telecommunications revolution that we've been talking about. So all of those cell phone towers out there, Huawei's been building a lot of those. So in that sense, they've become a very good employer. So there'll be more and more examples like that, but there's still going to be the ones that are challenging too, the companies that are just arriving and don't know how to do business in a way that's responsible.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm a reporter from Xinhua News Agency, and I want to ask some questions for Mr. Zhou and in Chinese. 我想问一下啊，就是咱们中国在这个非洲做农业投资，包括这个买地种粮的时间也比较长了。但是现在就我们昨天听咱们那个进出口银行的李若谷行长说，在农业投资这方面的难度会远远大于其他的领域。然后我想问一下，咱们这块在非洲究竟是一个什么样的发展现状？另外就是在这个当地的规则，还包括咱们国内外市场，包括像物流啊、制度啊这方面的一些对接、市场对接上面，是不是存在一些很大的困难？这些困难究竟是什么？谢谢。
Probably I'll answer a question in English, make all my panelists understandable. Yeah, just like I've mentioned, a few examples about the difficulties, and also bankers raise the same kind of question. It is much more difficult than people can understand in the investment and also technology transfer in this agricultural field. The problem is there, but the biggest problem is that for lack of understanding of the difficulties. If you fully understand what difficulty you're going to feel, and you're going to prepare for that, that will be pretty easier to do. But the biggest question biggest problem for Chinese industry, for Chinese business, is that Chinese African study is pretty low level. We need a lot of people to study African, to study Africa, to study African culture, to study everything about Africa. When we have a good intellectual group of people to understand Africa, then all these problems will be much easier to resolve. So this is the first question. And also, on the agricultural fields, we do have some successful examples which I didn't mention. That is, we have the cotton being grown in Malawi, which turned out to be pretty successful. But anyway, in agricultural fields, it's long-term investment and high-risk investment. It's being affected by the world market very much. And this African culture is not being well protected. So they are the most vulnerable in the world market for these agricultural products. This is all these challenges you are going to face if you enter into African agricultural fields. But anyway, I think as we move along and work together, as Deborah said, we have this bumper road and we learn pretty fast and work together with the African country and the African people. I think we can manage all these difficulties because we need this.
I've got another question from the center of the room then. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anne Shongwe. I am a social entrepreneur. I run a mobile learning business in South Africa and in Kenya. I think one of the things for us as entrepreneurs and small entrepreneurs is what investment vehicles there are to invest in us. We find that there's dribs and drabs of money, small pieces, $10,000, $25,000. That's not going to enable us to scale. And we're many of us, we're growing. There's thousands and thousands of exciting entrepreneurs that are coming out of the African continent. But as long as we don't have investments that enable us to do perhaps what your K-Lab project did to be able to transform the education system or come up with new educational models, it's not going to happen. So we have big, grandiose ideas to transform how learning happens in the South African context. But whenever we have conversations, everybody says, okay, we'll give you a little bit here so you can have a little pilot project in the corner over there. We'll never change, we'll never grow. So I think as we think about this innovation and investment conversation, we really need to come up with new instruments that take it down to the level of smaller entrepreneurs who have big ideas and are ready to change where big government institutions are not even willing to test new ideas because the system just doesn't show you how. So I'd like to hear from you whether there are any ideas of that or whether we can work with you to create those if they don't exist.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to try an innovative solution to bring our discussion to a conclusion by leveraging off those comments and saying that we now have our president in place for entrepreneurship and innovation. We have a vice president in Monhla, and we have the advisory panel. So taking into account the comments from the floor, what advice as the advisory panel are you going to give to the president, and the vice president may start with her comments?
Although he knows that I'm ready to take over. I think we are all learning to find good solutions for our environments. And besides, there was a time when high risk was so exciting because it led to high returns. In effect, Africa is like that. People make the largest amount of returns in Africa because they take the largest amount of risk. However, in the process, there are a lot of things that we also have to learn about what the world expects of us and how we can use Africa's resources, not just South Africa, as development funding institutions, to leverage those of international investors from anywhere so that we can ensure that our entrepreneurs are receiving and are participating in the game as well to grow their livelihoods.
Deborah?
I think we need to think about what kind of policy environment needs to be put in place to foster the kinds of changes that we want to see in Africa. And I'm not sure we have really good guidance there. For example, the World Bank does a Doing Business survey, and it's a helpful tool in many ways. It has a lot of things that you can check off about what your country needs to be doing. And I know Rwanda has looked at this, and they have had task forces on different parts of that doing business survey, and they've checked off what they need to do to make it a good business environment. But I think it's really interesting that the World Bank's doing business survey ranks China pretty low as a place to do business. So if we're looking at criteria that really are in place to foster entrepreneurship and innovation, I think China's done rather well. And so what is it that China's doing that isn't being reflected by the kind of advice that the powerful agencies are giving to countries in Africa about how to attract innovation, how to build a base for entrepreneurship and foreign investment to come in? So I think we need to take another look at what countries need to be doing.
Claire?
Well, I would push for an agenda for more integration within Africa. I think that the fact that it's very difficult to get around within Africa, whether it's through travel or visas, you need a visa for almost every country. I don't see, for example, why an African needs a visa to another African city. In Rwanda, we've waived requirement for visas before going to any country. But also the issue of broadband, linking cities. I don't see why Africans cannot have one program that can actually link cities. We've just worked with Korea Telecom to start a last mile access network for the whole of Rwanda within 3 years, and Korea Telecom is investing together with government. Why not the whole of Africa?
Zhong, I've got about 30 seconds to share between yourself and the president, so...
Thank you. Just very short. I'm pretty confident. I think for the next 30 years, we'll see the whole continent rising, just like what happened in China before. And so let's be optimistic about that. We probably have some difficulties and hardship, but we eventually will come to see a very prosperous and happy Africa.
And Johendra, finally from you.
I think the most important thing about being an entrepreneur is that you have to have a can-do attitude. And Africa has been difficult, so that it's actually got a phenomenal stock of entrepreneurs, but its risk now, relative to the rest of the world, is much low. So what we should be finding ways to do is to unleash the potential of entrepreneurs in Africa, and I think we'll find all the solutions.
Thank you to my esteemed panelists, thank you to the audience, and thank you to our viewers. That brings us to the conclusion of the CNBC Africa debate, coming to you from the annual meeting of New Champions 2013, Dalian, People's Republic of China. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.